"Garrett, I need to talk to you." He recognized the number. He hadn't heard the voice in 14 months. "I'm listening," he said. A long pause. Then, "I made a mistake." Garrett Ellison set down his coffee. He looked out the window of his office. A real office now. Not the kitchen table. Not the corner of a rented apartment with the furniture pushed back to make room for the wheelchair. An actual office with his name on the door and 2 agents working the floor below, and a golden retriever named Copper sleeping under his desk like he owned the place. "Diane," he said quietly, "what exactly are you calling to tell me?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I saw the article, the magazine. I saw what you've built, and I just—" Her voice broke slightly. "I didn't think you were going to be okay," he finished. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. "I am okay," Garrett said. And then he said something she hadn't expected. He said it without bitterness, without performance, without any of the anger she probably deserved and had perhaps been bracing for. "I'm better than okay, Diane. I just can't talk right now." He ended the call. Copper lifted his head from under the desk, looked at Garrett for a moment, then put his head back down. Garrett stared at the phone, and then he thought about the morning she left, the note, the wheelchair that was still warm, and everything that happened in the 14 months between that Thursday morning and this Tuesday afternoon. Because that's the story, not the phone call. What happened in between. Before we go any further, take 1 second right now, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. I am genuinely curious how far these stories travel. To understand what Diane walked away from, you have to understand who Garrett Ellison was before the accident. He was 30 years old, high school football coach at Riverside Academy in Clarkfield, Tennessee. Not a fancy program, not the kind that made regional headlines, but the kind where the same kids who showed up in August as boys came back in December as something a little closer to men. He ran half marathons on Saturday mornings for no reason other than he liked the way the city looked at 5:30 a.m. when it was still mostly quiet. He made his own coffee every morning, a whole production, a hand grinder and everything, and he spent his weekends either on a trail or in somebody's kitchen, cooking something that required more steps than it had any right to require. He was, by most accounts, a man who occupied his life fully. He met Diane at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. She was in corporate marketing, sharp, funny, put together in the way of someone who had decided early that presentation was a form of communication, and had committed to it. They talked for 3 hours and left before the cake was cut, because neither of them wanted the conversation to end in a crowd. They dated for 2 years. They married on a Saturday in September, outdoor ceremony. Nobody's feet stayed dry because it rained, and nobody cared because the sun came out right as they were exchanging vows and the whole thing looked like a movie. For 3 years after the wedding, life was what they had planned it to be. Not perfect, no life is, but good. Genuinely good. Garrett was up for an athletic director position at the district level. Diane had been promoted twice. They were saving for a house. They argued about normal things, whose turn it was to call the plumber, whether they needed a 3rd streaming subscription, and made up the way people make up when they're not actually broken, just busy, and occasionally inconsiderate. Then came the accident. It was a Tuesday in October, late practice. One of his players had been struggling with his footwork all week, and Garrett stayed an extra hour working through it with him on the field. He was driving home in the dark, tired in the specific way that coaches are tired. Not physically exhausted, but mentally drained. The kind of tired that comes from spending your whole day investing in other people's potential. He didn't see the truck run the red light. The impact took him into the driver's side door. The car spun. He remembered the sound. Not a crash exactly, more like the world rearranging itself around him at very high speed. And then he remembered nothing until the hospital ceiling. The spinal compression was at L1. The doctors were careful with their language. Significant mobility impairment. Ongoing rehabilitation recommended. Recovery trajectory uncertain. What that translated to, in the practical language of daily life, was a wheelchair. For now. Possibly longer. Possibly permanently. Diane was at the hospital within 20 minutes of the call. She sat beside him for 4 days straight. She held his hand. She cried in the hallway when she thought he was asleep. He wasn't, but he let her have that, because he understood that the person who loves someone in a hospital bed is also going through something, just differently. He told her, on the 4th day, "You don't have to do this." She looked at him like he'd said something offensive. "Don't do that," she said. "Don't make decisions for me." He believed her. He should not have believed her, not because she was lying. She wasn't lying in that moment. But there is a version of ourselves that exists in the acute shock of a crisis, the version that rises to the occasion, that finds reserves of love and patience we didn't know we had. And there is the everyday version, the one that has to live with the reality when the crisis stops being a crisis and becomes simply life. Diane was extraordinary in the emergency. She was not built for the ordinary. The first year was hard in the ways everyone expects: the physical therapy, the apartment modifications, the learning curve of a life restructured around a wheelchair, the routes that worked, the restaurants with actual accessibility, the 1,000 small daily negotiations between what Garrett wanted to do independently and what required asking for help. Garrett hated asking for help, not out of pride exactly, but because asking for help meant watching Diane's face, and Diane's face had started doing something he noticed around month 8. A very small thing, almost nothing, but he was a coach. He spent his career reading the faces of teenagers trying to hide what they were feeling. He knew the face of someone working very hard to appear okay. She never said a word about it. She was too careful for that. She cooked. She drove him to appointments. She smiled in the right places. She told her friends the right things. And every night, she fell asleep on her side of the bed, facing the wall, in the specific way of someone who has stopped turning toward the person beside them. By year 2, the silences were different. Not the comfortable silences of people who know each other well enough to be quiet together. The other kind. The kind that have weight. Garrett began spending his evenings differently. Not out of resignation. He was not a man who resigned himself to things. Out of necessity. The coaching job had been put on hold. The school had held his position for a year, and then, politely and apologetically, had to fill it. He understood. He didn't perform bitterness about it. What he did instead was start reading real estate, market analysis, property law. He'd always understood instinctively how neighborhoods worked. It was the same skill set as coaching, really. Reading systems, identifying undervalued potential, making connections other people missed. He started with online courses. He took the licensing exam from his laptop at the kitchen table. He passed on the first attempt. Diane didn't know until he told her. She said, "That's wonderful." She said it the way you say something, when you're genuinely surprised, but also, beneath the surprise, recalculating something you'd already decided. The divorce was not announced. It arrived. One Thursday morning in March, Garrett came back from the bathroom to find a suitcase by the door that had not been there 20 minutes before. He looked at the suitcase. He looked at Diane, who was standing in the kitchen with her keys in her hand and her coat already on. She had a note. She placed it on the counter. "I love you," she said, "but I can't do this anymore. I'm not built for this life." He looked at her for a long moment. "Is there someone else?" he asked. The answer was in the half-second before she answered. "That's not what this is about." "Diane." A breath. "There's someone I've been talking to." "Yes." He nodded slowly. He looked at the note on the counter. He looked at the suitcase. He looked at her face, the face of someone who had made a decision, and was afraid of the response, and was also, beneath the fear, relieved. The relief was the part that told him everything he needed to know. "Okay," he said. "Garrett, I'm not going to make this harder than it has to be." He turned his chair toward the window. "Lock up on your way out." She stood there for another moment, maybe waiting for the anger, maybe waiting for the version of this scene where he said something that gave her permission to feel like the leaving was justified. He didn't give her that. He heard the door close. He sat at the window and watched her car pull out of the parking lot below. He sat there for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called his broker, Adele. "I need a listing," he said. "I'm ready to go." Adele paused. "You just called me out of nowhere at 8:30 in the morning." "I have a lot of mornings now." She laughed. "Okay, let's go. 14 months. That was the distance between the morning Diane closed the door and the Tuesday afternoon she called back. In those 14 months, Garrett Ellison closed 11 property deals from his kitchen table and 3 more from his new office, which he signed the lease on in month 9. He recruited 2 agents, one a recent college grad, one a veteran who'd been burned by a bad brokerage and needed somewhere that operated with integrity. He started a first-generation homebuyer fund that helped 16 families in Clarkfield navigate down payment assistance programs in its first year, because he remembered being 24 and thinking home ownership was something that happened to other people. He went to physical therapy every Tuesday and Thursday morning, not because the doctors were promising him he'd walk again, Nobody was promising him anything, but because his body was the machine he lived in, and he was going to take care of it the way he'd always taken care of things. Consistently, without drama. He got Copper from a rescue in month 4. A 2-year-old golden retriever who had been returned twice by previous owners for being too much energy, and who, within 48 hours of arriving in Garrett's apartment, had decided that the space under the desk was his, and that the man in the wheelchair was his person, and that these were the 2 most important facts in his world. Garrett's mother visited in month 7. She sat at his kitchen table, watched him work, watched him manage 3 phone calls back to back, while simultaneously reviewing a contract and keeping Copper from eating a real estate pamphlet. And she said, "You're okay." Not a question. "Yeah," Garrett said. "I mean, actually okay. I know what you meant." She stayed for a week, she cooked, she watched her son run a business from a wheelchair in a rented apartment, and she cried once. In private. Not from sadness exactly, but from the specific emotion that doesn't have a clean name. The one where someone you love turns out to be more than you knew, and the knowing of it catches you off guard. His father came the following month, former Army, not a man of many words. He walked through the office, looked at the license on the wall, looked at the 2 agents at their desks, looked at Copper, asleep under Garrett's desk, looked at his son. He put his hand on Garrett's shoulder, left it there for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandfather would have liked this." That was all. It was enough. The magazine feature came out on a Wednesday in May. Regional Real Estate Rising Stars. Garrett was 3rd on the list. The journalist had spent an afternoon with him, in the office, then at a property he was showing, then back at the office, and had written about 14 months of building something from nothing, with the kind of specificity that only comes when a story genuinely surprises the person telling it. The photograph was the one that mattered. Garrett in his chair, at his desk, Copper visible in the lower right corner of the frame, both of them looking directly at the camera, not performing strength, not performing anything, just present, just there. The caption under the photograph said, "I had to figure out what I was actually made of. Turns out I needed the hard years to find out." He didn't know Diane had seen it until she called. And here's the thing about that phone call, the one we started with. Garrett sitting at his desk, Diane's voice on the other end, saying I made a mistake. He had imagined this conversation, not obsessively. He wasn't a man who spent his emotional energy on imagined conversations. But he'd thought about it, the way you think about something you know might be coming, not because you want it, but because it's the kind of thing that tends to arrive. He'd thought he would feel more when it came. What he actually felt was something closer to distance, not coldness, not satisfaction, just distance. The specific, quiet distance of someone who has traveled far enough from a place that they no longer feel its pull. "I'm better than okay, Diane. I just can't talk right now." He meant it. She called twice more that week. He let both calls go to voicemail. He wasn't punishing her. He needed her to understand something that could not be communicated through a phone call. There was nothing to go back to, not because of anger, because the life she'd left had been used as raw material to build something else entirely, and the something else did not have a door with her name on it. Diane, it turned out, had not fared as cleanly. The man she'd been talking to during the marriage had lasted 8 months past the divorce, before deciding that Diane, in real life, was more complicated than Diane he'd met while she was still technically married to someone else. She was back in a studio apartment in Nashville. The promotion she'd been expecting had gone to a colleague. Her mother, who had quietly disapproved of the way the marriage ended, and who had met Garrett twice and liked him both times, had said very little, and the little she said was enough. Garrett heard this through the same mutual friend who had told him about the other man 14 months earlier. The mutual friend reported it without editorializing, which Garrett appreciated. He thought about it for about 30 minutes. Then Copper nudged his hand with his nose, and Garrett looked at him and said, "Yeah, you're right," and went back to work. The call Garrett did take that week, it was from one of the 16 families his homebuyer fund had helped that year. A woman named Terry, 38 years old, single mother of 2, who had just gotten the keys to her first home that afternoon, and was calling because she didn't know who else to call, and she wanted someone to know. "I'm standing in my kitchen," she said. "My actual kitchen. In my actual house." Garrett leaned back in his chair. "What does it look like?" "It looks like mine," she said, and her voice broke open. He sat on the phone with her for 20 minutes. He asked about the kids. He asked about the neighborhood. He asked about the backyard. "There was a tree," she said. a big oak, and her son had already asked if they could build something in it. "Tell him yes," Garrett said. After they hung up, Garrett sat in his office with Copper's head on his knee and the afternoon light coming through the window at the angle it came through every day at this hour, and he felt the specific, uncomplicated warmth of a life that was, against all the odds that had been stacked against it, good. Not despite the chair, not in spite of anything that had happened, just good. Garrett still had the note. Same kitchen drawer. Same fold. He'd moved once. The apartment to the office to the building he eventually bought a share of. And the note had traveled with him. Not because he was sentimental about it. Because it was the document that marked the beginning. I love you, but I can't do this anymore. I'm not built for this life. I hope you understand. He did understand. He understood that Diane had made a decision based on what she saw in front of her. A wheelchair. A hard road. A life that didn't look like the plan. What she couldn't see, what he hadn't yet built, was everything that came after. The accident took things from Garrett Ellison. Real things. The coaching job he loved. The version of his body he'd inhabited for 30 years. The marriage he'd believed in. These were losses. He wasn't going to pretend they weren't. But the accident also did something else. Something nobody writes a magazine article about because it's harder to photograph. It forced him to find out what he was made of when everything optional was stripped away. And what he found was this. He was made of the same thing he'd always been made of. The same material that kept him on the practice field an extra hour working footwork with a kid who needed it. The same material that hand ground his coffee at 5 in the morning because the ritual mattered. The same material that, on the morning his wife took her suitcase and her keys and her carefully written note, turned to the window and made a phone call instead of falling apart. The chair was a fact. What he built from it was a choice. And Diane, sitting in her Nashville studio apartment, looking at the photograph in a magazine of the man she left. The man in the chair. The man who wasn't supposed to be okay. The man looking directly at the camera with Copper in the corner of the frame. She finally understood what she had actually left behind. It was never the man in the wheelchair. It was the man who, when the world took everything from him, quietly decided to build something better. She had called it a burden. He had called it Tuesday. If this story reached something real in you today, if you thought of someone while you were listening, someone who's been underestimated, someone still in their hard season, someone the world has already written off, then this story did exactly what it was supposed to do. We are American Truth Tales. Hit the like button. 1 second. Right now. It tells us to keep going. Subscribe to American Truth Tales. We are here every single week with the stories that don't make the evening news but absolutely should. The ones about ordinary people doing extraordinary things quietly. Because that's who they are. Leave a comment. I want to know which moment hit you hardest in Garrett's story. I read every single comment. Every one. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next one.